Vice President Harris has released her 10-point policy response to the housing crisis, and President Trump has done the same by releasing his 5-point policy. In this video, I'll break down both approaches, diving into the details to see where each one shines or falls short. Stick around to find out which policies hold the most promise and which ones might need a closer look. I'm Haefer, a financial coach and a realtor with the top team in Lynchburg, Virginia. My mission? To demystify and unbrainwash people about wealth and real estate. Welcome to our movement. Before switching to real estate, I served 11 years in government, so I have a pretty solid perspective on what policies will actually do. This is an educational video only. I'm not telling you who to vote for. Quite frankly, I don't like either candidate, and I'm disgusted with the way both candidates strategically disrespected their party's primaries. So I'm probably going to say something that ticks you off, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. What I will do is show you their policies as written, as well as any clarifications they've made since the release. You will see the actual policies, and I'll elaborate on them based on the candidates' interviews and speeches that they use to elaborate on their own policies. Each policy will receive an objective rating up to 5 stars, 1 star for each qualification. The first qualification is legality. A policy needs to stay clear of criminal and political misuse, but if there's any history or alarming potential of political corruption tied to the policy, then it will not earn this star. Constitutionality. Both candidates have seen their policies challenged on constitutional grounds before. We'll explore if these new proposals have the authority to stand or might hit a roadblock with the Supreme Court. Action without Congress. Can these policies take effect without the House or the Senate? Realistically, if congressional approval is needed, it may stall out. We all know that. Even with a blue wave or a red wave election, that does not guarantee smooth sailing for these policies. Impact on less than 50% of Americans. This star requires the policy makes tangible differences even if it doesn't cover most Americans. Impact on more than 50% of Americans. The gold standard and the hardest star to earn. For a policy to achieve this, it must create realistic and widespread benefits. Now, it is rare for a policy to hit all 5 stars, but 3 stars, that should be a reasonable threshold, right? So let's see how these proposals measure up. My mother raised me as a gentleman, so I say, ladies first. Let's take a look at Vice President Kamala Harris's policies regarding the housing crisis. If you take a close look at the wording, you can see that there were 2 policies here. But the first policy, which was Biden's, has actually been substituted. So basically, this went from a tax credit under Biden to a down payment loan under Harris. In English, initially this campaign policy was a tax credit just like Trump's, but that was nixed and is now a loan. This provides low-income families a federal loan to cover their down payment on their first home. Basically, it's a federal student loan combined with Virginia's first-time homebuyers program. The loan will require to be paid in full within 4 years. For many in our area, that would equate to about $573 in monthly payments, or another car payment. The problem is that many first-time homebuyers can't get approved for mortgages in the first place because their debt-to-income ratio is too high, not because they can't afford the down payment. And increasing a person's debt hurts them in the long run. It does not help them. Nonetheless, this debt will assist first-time homebuyers into getting into their first home. This policy is awarded 3 stars. It gets 1 star for legality, 1 star for constitutionality, and 1 star for helping less than 50% of Americans objectively. Alright, so this one sounds really easy, but it's actually very involved. I would rename this deregulate local state building requirements and increase supply. The idea here is to speed up construction by providing builders with more materials and loosening local and state regulations that can slow down the building process. But this solution misses the mark. The material shortage that affected the industry was largely resolved before 2023, so the supply is not the main issue anymore. What we're really lacking is an adequate workforce of builders, and this policy does not address that. Additionally, federal power generally doesn't extend to purposely overriding local and state regulations, making this policy both unrealistic and ineffective. Sadly, this policy has a large history of corruption. It is not constitutional and would not help a realistic number of Americans. But since this is a regulatory policy, it could be approved without Congress. However, it would be overthrown at the U.S. Supreme Court once states sued for overreach power. This policy is essentially a tax incentive for builders to start building starter homes in low-income neighborhoods. It would give builders a tax credit if they're building or flipping homes that would otherwise be too costly or too difficult to develop. For example, if a development required a state road expansion, which the builder could not afford, then the federal government would allow the developer to obtain part of it back as a tax credit. This applies only for homes that would be considered low income or starter homes. The problem? As stated in the policy, the repair is too costly, but the tax credit doesn't occur until the next year, so the builders still have to suffer that repair cost up front. It doesn't make sense. They can't afford it. So this one earns 3 stars. It is legal, it is constitutional, and it would realistically help some Americans. So I did not forget to include the policy in this one. It literally just says the title. There's no description. This basically is just expanding low-income rental tax credits. If you've noticed here in Lynchburg, we're not only facing an increase in qualified housing voucher program applicants, but we're having fewer and fewer homes qualify for the program. So demand is increasing and supplies decreasing. Part of that decrease was due to decreased tax incentives for investors to supply qualified housing, so previous voucher homes were converted to unqualifying businesses. So this policy is a great idea. However, the main reason many investors converted away from this in the first place was because federal regulations were beyond unreasonable and were overly impressive with high government fees. Not worth the tax credit. And yes, this will increase federal spending. So since the administration has increased regulations as far as low-income housing over the last 4 years, it is reasonable to assume that it is not going to help a tangible amount of people, because investors don't want to deal with the oppressive regulations. However, this does earn 2 stars, 1 for legality and 1 for being constitutional. This jumbled block of a mess is actually 3 policies. So for transparency, we'll review as such and rate each respectfully. The first policy here is federally fund innovative housing. This is a great policy, just terrible timing. The policy basically gives federal funds to research and develop cheaper home developments without decreasing regulations. A good example, container homes. You know the containers seen on trains and ships, they're converted into tiny homes? We actually have one here on Bateman Bridge Road in Forest, and we have a developer here in Lynchburg City proper. The problem is this increases federal spending, which increases inflation. So ultimately, it would hurt all Americans at this time in history. Good policy, but defeated by terrible timing. Now, this would help a small amount of Americans, so even though it would simultaneously hurt them, I'm still going to give it the objective star it deserves. So this policy gets 3 stars. 1 star for legality, 1 star for constitutionality, and 1 star for helping a limited number of Americans. This brings us to Kamala Harris's 6th policy, a $40 billion grant. This is a grant for local businesses through the middlemen of states and localities, and the policy doubles the current grant. Not only does this increase inflation, but these low-income focused projects do not have a positive ROI record. They do have a historical record of foreclosures, and they have a huge history of political corruption. Think of how many stories you've seen yourself where local politicians have embezzled and misused this kind of grant money. With that being said, this only gets 1 star, and that's because it is a constitutional policy. The other policy is open federal land for construction. This policy has some juice to it, okay? Harris, Trump, and Vance all support this policy. However, the vice president candidate Walz is opposed to it and even voiced his opposition during the vice presidential debate. It's a wonderful idea in areas that have national lands near cities, but that's a pretty small pool overall. As you can see here in the map, there's not that much federal land that would actually be applicable to a majority of Americans. The other issue is that Congress would need to pass legislation on this, so that negatively affects both Harris and Trump's attempt here. This policy gets 3 stars. It is legal, it is constitutional, and it does help some Americans. Vice President Harris has shown support for restricting certain aspects of free speech, including the context of the free market housing. Her reasoning? Investors use sites like Zillow and others to gauge what similar rentals are charging, helping them set competitive prices, or in her opinion, price fixing. But renters use these sites too, to avoid overpaying for a place to live in. Under this new plan, landlords, management companies, and realtors would no longer be allowed to post the rental prices online. While intended to prevent price inflation, this move would limit transparency, making it harder for renters to compare prices and for landlords to compete fairly. And it would increase rental costs significantly, the exact opposite of its intended purpose. The result could lead to less market clarity for everyone unless realtors extend their services to include rental searches like they do in larger cities like New York. Now look, I'm a realtor. I want people to use my services, and I think it's the best investment decision they could make. However, I do not want the government to essentially mandate that people use my services because they can't see the prices for themselves. This policy gets 0 stars. It has too much case for corruption. It would not be considered constitutional since it infringes on the freedom of speech. It would not be allowed without a congressional amendment. And realistically, it wouldn't help anybody. This policy has a distinct stick-to-the-man tone. Essentially, it would increase taxes on anyone who owns multiple rental properties and also holds retirement funds in a 401k or similar investment vehicle. The message: you're penalized for diversifying your retirement through both stocks and real estate. The act also penalizes owning rental properties outside of your home state. So if you live in Alaska, but you want to have rental property in a college town, say Lynchburg, Virginia, federal actions or penalties would kick in. This broad approach would discourage equal opportunity investments and hit regular middle-class people just trying to build a balanced life. This policy gets 0 stars. Although California has similar laws and it does penalize other states and public servants if they do not abide by those state laws, this does not mean that the federal branch has the authority to penalize people who decide to conduct themselves with interstate investments. This would encourage people to fudge their home address or use their children or other family members in those states as straw man purchasers, which is why this policy does not get the legal star. This regulation would face constitutional challenges based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In this scenario, if the president wanted to discourage interstate investments in a particular state, they would need to work with Congress to enact legislation that would impose those restrictions or penalties on such investments. This could involve creating a new regulation, modifying existing laws, or providing tax incentives for investments in other states. This ultimately does not tangibly help anybody. All right, the 10th and final one is keep the Federal Reserve chairman. This policy came out after the written one and was based on some of the interviews that she's done. If you didn't know, Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, is a supporter of Bidenomics and a Republican who was given the job by President Trump himself. And in 2022, Powell said that, and I quote, "While higher interest rates, slower growth, and softer labor market conditions will bring down inflation, they will also bring some pain to households and businesses. These are the unfortunate costs of reducing inflation." How nice. Basically, that means the government can keep spending more money, raise interest rates, penalize businesses to the point they fire people, and that trickles down into the American home and hurts the middle class and even the lower class. Kamala Harris has repeatedly voiced her ongoing support of Bidenomics as well as the chairman and said she wouldn't change a thing. Obviously, this policy has not helped us. We all feel that with the job layoffs and the rising food costs. And we know it's not fair that we get fired so that the government can continue funding programs to find extraterrestrial life forms, participate in the Paris Accord, and fund endless wars. So as far as legality, it gets that star. Constitutionality, 1 star. It does not need action from Congress, so it gets a 3rd star as well. Now let's switch over to the other side of the aisle and see what the Republican ticket has to offer. Fire the Federal Reserve chair. Okay, this policy came out just after the written one. Ironically, Jerome Powell, as I stated, was hired by President Trump, and he is a Republican. But Trump has vowed to do another unprecedented action, the first firing of the chair of the Federal Reserve. The question is, can he? This is a tangled question because if Trump was reelected immediately, then he obviously could. But he's technically not the incumbent. So this might very well go to the Supreme Court for an answer if the Democrats control the House and the Senate. Nonetheless, there is no data to indicate that the president cannot do this. So because there's no factual opposition, this gets all 5 stars. There is a lot to unpack there. So we'll respect this by treating it like separate policies or forks just like we did with Vice President Kamala Harris's policy. Open federal land for construction. We already reviewed this because Vice President Harris has also submitted this exact policy. Who thought of it first? I don't know, and it doesn't matter because it's a good policy from both parties. All right, cut interest rates. Now, Trump has suggested to do the complete opposite of Kamala Harris. Some economists worry that this will cause more inflation, but they said the same thing during his last presidency, and yet the economy grew to be one of the strongest in U.S. history, with record low inflation until he started printing out money to combat the impacts of the pandemic response. Yes, I know President Biden did that too, and that also contributed to today's inflation. I'm not trying to point fingers here. I'm just trying to be objective. Now, to be completely transparent and objective, President Obama's mortgage rate average was at 4.35%, and under Trump, without 2020, it was 4.32. That's a lot better than what we experienced this week when the feds raised the rates, and now we're seeing an average of 6.5. This may lower mortgage payments by as much as 21%. So how would you like an extra 21% in your paycheck? I know I would. This policy has won all 5 stars. It is legal, it is constitutional, it does not require Congress, and it helps every American. First-time homebuyer tax credit. I cannot think of a better policy, and I wish that Biden could get this one passed when he tried. The only better policy there is slashing interest rates. Basically, if you're a first-time homebuyer, which makes up about 26% of Americans, then you will get a tax break the year after you buy your first home. Biden tried to pass this but failed. Just like with all tax policies, it must be passed by Congress first. I really wish Kamala Harris would have kept this one in her playbook, but she decided loans were better. This policy gets 3 stars. Now, I'm going to try to explain this last one very, very carefully because there are a lot of technicalities with this one. Home prices are based on supply and demand. Positive birth rates and immigration make a bigger population. Bigger population means bigger demand. And the bigger demand means the bigger the house price. But, and this is a big but, most of the current immigrants addressed here are not, by the letter of the law, illegal. That's because President Biden has superseded the current immigration laws with an app sign-in. So the immigrants are not vetted, but they are also technically legal. And this may protect thousands and thousands of people from deportation. Overall, this policy gets just 3 stars. Do you believe that we would see legal and constitutional battles with this one? Of course, definitely. There's no question there. And they will go to the U.S. Supreme Court for many years. As far as helping Americans, now this part needs clarification. Stopping the flow of immigration will slow down the rising home prices for everybody, but removing the current legal immigrants is a red herring. So if we take out the red herring, we see that this policy helps most Americans, naturally born, current, legal immigrants, etc., whether or not Republicans want to admit they're legal or not. All right, so now that we've looked at all the policy differences, let's see what the numbers point to. For Vice President Kamala Harris, overall, she got just 2 stars with a 40% effective rate. 60% of her policies are legal, 70% are constitutional, 20% of her policies don't require Congress, which basically means if she fails, she'll be able to blame Congress instead of taking full ownership. 50% of her policies help less than half Americans, and 0 of her policies helped a majority of Americans. As for President Trump, overall his policies scored 3.6 stars with a 76% effective rate. 80% of his policies are legal, 80% of his policies are constitutional. To no one's surprise, 60% of his policies don't require Congress. And that is why, if elected, he would automatically have a higher chance of successfully implementing his policies. That's a good thing. 100% of his policies are focused on helping Americans, and 60% of his policies even help a majority of Americans. As a real estate professional, I see firsthand the impact of government policies on housing affordability, market stability, and community development. From zoning regs to tax incentives, these policies shape the housing landscape and influence my clients' ability to buy, sell, and rent real estate. It's crucial to elect leaders who understand the complexities of the housing market and who are committed to policies that promote home ownership, support renters, and revitalize our communities. Your voice matters. Voting for a president is like a long game of chess. I'm voting, that is, moving the pieces strategically so that my family, my friends, and my clients can win for generations to come. I encourage you to research each candidate and to vote for the one who is capable and the one who aligns with your vision for the future of housing in our country. And lastly, no matter who becomes president, I want you to keep this Bible verse in mind.